This presentation segment will focus on the complex relationship between witchcraft and Christianity influences in South Africa. By observing these two phenomena in juxtaposition, my hope is to offer a more precise understanding of how Western prejudice misinterpreted witchcraft practices and influenced dangerous implications in their post-colonial era. First will be the basis of their terminology, beginning with Christianity. Christianity is a religious belief system, and a belief system is defined as a configuration of ideas and attitudes in which the elements are bound together by some form of constraint or functional interdependence, which in turn belief is static and requires a faith-based approach. In contrast, witchcraft practices exist as an epistemology rooted in tradition linked by dynamic forces of culture. Epistemology is defined in the dictionary as the philosophical study of human knowledge, nature, origin, and limits. As culture shifts across different spaces and time, so does the conceptualization of witchcraft as an effort to make sense of the ever-changing world. An oversimplification of South Africa's worldview is that it is human-centered, though it experiences ancestral powers and acts of supernatural forces. Unlike Christianity, witchcraft practices are not a question of faith, but simply their culturally constructed reality. I find that culture can best be depicted by the famous quote that compares culture to the sea we swim in, so pervasive, so all-consuming that we fail to notice its existence until we step out of it. Witchcraft is the response to spiritual insecurity and acts as a way to explain how one interprets the unexplainable aspects of life, such as mental illness or natural disaster. The second part of this segment will focus on colonization. The current stigma attached to witchcraft practices in South Africa cannot be understood without acknowledging their history of colonization. South Africa's story is one of complexity that deserves further in-depth research. However, for the sake of timeliness, I am going to offer a brief summary to build context. The European influence began as early as the 1400s when the Portuguese utilized South Africa as a pit stop along an alternate route to the famous Silk Road, optimistically naming it the Cape of Good Hope. As word traveled amongst the trade routes, the Cape of Good Hope quickly evolved into a rumored Cape of Great Wealth Opportunity. As this word reached the Dutch East Indian Trading Company, they successfully established a settlement known as Cape Town in 1652 by utilizing slavery and the forced labor model by exploiting indigenous South Africans. As South Africa continued to gain its popularity as a critical location for trade, British colonizers came to claim their piece of the pie. Britain's invasion of Cape Colony from 1795 to 1806 pushed their Dutch opposition from the coast to the interior territories. Soon after, precious diamonds and gold were discovered in the Northeast Territories and became the main economic driving force behind bloody battles for colonization. South Africa then shifted from a primarily agricultural society to a mining society that continued to exploit natives for cheap labor. Though British colonizers maintained their control, it is essential to mention the incredible resistance of South African tribes like the Zulu. They did not roll over passively. On the contrary, the year of 1879 marked the beginning of a 6-month Anglo-Zulu war fought between British Empire and Zulu Kingdom. Once the Zulu Kingdom was unfortunately defeated, the British Empire turned its attention to South African Dutch colonizers referred to as the Boers. The Anglo-Boer South African War lasted from 1899 to 1902. With Britain winning imperial rule by creating the Union of South Africa through the signing of the South Africa Act in 1909, the all-white government immediately began enforcing policies of racial segregation by carving out lines of separation to decrease the potential for a unified power of Black South Africa and placing them into Bantustan territories. Families were forcibly removed from their homes and farmlands, which were the basis of their income. These territories were overcrowded and undesirable locations with infertile soil. Without land and agriculture, poverty was inevitably reproduced, resulting in Black South Africans being pushed to the bottom of a socioeconomic hierarchy. The Glenn Gray Act of 1894 extended voting privileges to Black South Africans. However, eligibility was based on land ownership, which many have been systematically deprived of. This had severe impacts on voting rights as it drastically reduced the legal representation of South Africans. The Native Land Act of 1913 granted only 7% of the land to Black Native South Africans, leaving the other 93% for white minorities to farm. As the monarchy ended in 1961, the Union of South Africa became the Republic of South Africa. Around this time, the Western world was fascinated by a new pseudoscience of eugenics that supported white supremacy. This pseudoscience allocated for white minority rule known as apartheid. The apartheid was a system of legislation that upheld segregationist policies against non-white citizens. In response to stark inequalities of structural racism, anti-apartheid campaigns responded and practiced a series of passive displays featuring well-known figures of history such as Gandhi. These passive displays came to a gruesome halt after the Sharpeville massacre of nonviolent protesters in 1960, when the police opened fire on Black members of the Pan-Africanist Congress and African National Congress. Sharpeville marked the switch from a peaceful movement to one of forceful resistance in pursuit of justice. After a decade of violence, imprisonment of officials, and civilian deaths, the United Nations brought an official end to the apartheid regime. Followed by the reform and the freeing of Nelson Mandela, all South Africans finally received representation through voting rights, which empowered individuals to increase political activism for a unified coalition that represented a non-white majority. Multiple centuries of colonialism disputes led to the spread of Western belief systems that were combated with persistent resistance from Black and brown South Africans. This next segment will focus on Christianity's presence in South Africa. In post-colonial South Africa, Christianity is a byproduct of Western encroachment. Data collected from the General Household Survey questionnaire stated that as of 2013, a majority of 84.2% of South Africans sampled described their religious affiliation as Christian. In this sample, 31,486 households were visited across the country of South Africa, and 25,786 were successfully interviewed face-to-face. This was the first time that the GHS included a religious affiliation. Question. The survey included 2 questions about religion. 1. How would you describe your religious affiliation? And 2. Aside from weddings and funerals, how often do you attend religious services? Amid colonization, Western influences attested that their religious worldviews were one of supremacy and superiority, and that a Christian belief system was the sole inherent for explaining reality. Over time, Christianity entered political forces and spread rapidly through technological development. This became increasingly controversial as it undermined existing ancestral tribal power relations. The practice of witchcraft and its threat to the spirituality does not align with evangelical Christian plans. It has been publicly denounced as evil and possesses a significant threat to the nation. The Western ethnocentric framework furthered the stereotype that supported African irrationality. A white supremacist narrative emerged grounded by these stereotypes and colonizers' claims that Africans could not govern themselves without white overlords. Christian evangelist mission sought to control South Africa by forcing its way into political arenas that directly influenced political policies through institutionalized power relations. By also embedding itself in the social fabric of communities, it exerted its power over common sense meanings and routine activities diffused in the everyday life. Unfortunately, as this relationship grew between Christianity and politics, it spread into the communities, and the clash against traditional witchcraft increased with it. The final segment of this presentation will focus on the dangerous implications of Christianity. These clashes with Christianity have had dangerous implications for those who were suspected of being a witch. This is problematic because witchcraft is forbidden to be spoken about publicly and can only be practiced in private amongst other witches. If witches were to publicly announce their practices, their powers would cease to exist. This ambiguity leaves much room for accusation and wrongful persecution of innocent community members. Today, many South Africans are even sensitive to the title witch doctor that is associated with traditional medicines. They live in fear of being wrongfully labeled as a witch to the public, which significantly shifted the way modern South Africans sought out healing. Widespread forms of traditional healing are technically considered illegal under colonial-era legislation, and older women with strong ties to these conventional forms of healing face dangers of brutality. This is especially true for most of those who bore the brunt of the apartheid. Witchcraft suddenly was no longer a practice associated with healing or ancestral connections, but as a source of secret evil festering within the community. The fear attached to a witch's presence is used as justification for harsh punishment through deadly witch hunts as a way to preserve life and offer healing for the nation. In post-apartheid South Africa, the end of racial barriers was contradicted by the creation of stronger class hierarchies. This is accompanied by economic distress and resistance to control. Witchcraft exists as a way to combat fears of uncertainty from political and economic fluctuations. Even amid severe threats, practices exist in secrecy and will continue to respond to the spiritual insecurity within its communities. In this way, witchcraft acts as a form of post-colonial resistance in pursuit to derail Christianity's destructive source of political power.
Now, in order for us to get a solid idea of the impact that Islam has had on witchcraft in Southern Africa, we ought to begin by taking a look at the spread of the faith throughout the African continent in general, as well as how the faith reached Southern Africa. So, we begin in the 7th century when Arab forces invaded and conquered North Africa as part of the quest to spread Islam throughout the world and create one giant Islamic empire. Now, many decades after this conquest, there have been future international trade routes as well as military conflict that would continue to spread the faith throughout the African continent. And it was at this time that Arab traders had made their way to the Swahili coast, and in addition to the goods that they traded, faith was also exchanged. And although Islam quickly spread across the Swahili coast, mosques had not yet been built. That changed in the 11th century, when the Friday Mosque at Shanga was among the first to be built in the Swahili coast. And after the destruction of the mosque in 1075 AD, the mosque would then be rebuilt into something much more grand. Eventually, the faith would find its way to South Africa in the late 17th century. Now, among the influx of enslaved persons entering the country at this time were individuals from Indonesia who were either practicing Muslims or had become some of the first converts to Islam in South Africa. Today, Muslims make up approximately 1 to 3% of South Africa's total population, but that percentage is far greater in countries along the Swahili coast, such as Tanzania, where Muslims make up over 35% of the total population. And although Muslims in much of Southern Africa tend to be few and far between, they have still proven to be a very prominent force in the social and religious spheres. So now that we've gained a basic understanding of how Islam spread to Southern Africa, we ought to take a look at some of the core principles in the Islamic faith and how they end up clashing with witchcraft. So in the Islamic faith, a believer, regardless of whatever sect of Islam they practice, must adhere to a set of spiritual guidelines commonly known as the 5 pillars. And the pillar that is considered to be the most quintessential for every Muslim is the declaration of faith, or shahada in Arabic. Generally speaking, shahada entails a believer, typically a new convert, openly declaring their belief that there is only one God and the Prophet Muhammad is his messenger. Now, this declaration does share a relatively strong resemblance with the 10 Commandments that is adhered to in Judaism and Christianity, specifically the first commandment, which states, "Thou shalt hold no other gods before me." In the cases of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, A believer is essentially stating that they reject any belief in a higher power that is not God. And although the Shahada is by all accounts a personal admission of one's acceptance of the Islamic faith, this has not prevented Puritan Muslims from openly shaming non-believers. And in the case of Southern Africa, it is those individuals who practice witchcraft who are most commonly shamed. And according to scholars Yassin Ali and Sumaya Lair, it is a number of cultural factors that lead to a belief that witchcraft is essentially, quote, an act that brings one closer to the devil by using the devil, end quote. And given that most people, regardless of spiritual belief, tend to associate the devil with all things negative and grim, there is indeed a heavy stigma placed upon the overall practice of witchcraft, in addition to those who practice it and believe in its power. So now that we have established the stigma that is placed upon witchcraft by Islamic ideology and rhetoric, I'd like to take a look at some inconsistencies within that rhetoric. So despite the stigma that Islam places upon witchcraft, there does exist a rather mystical, almost occult-like quality to Islamic theology, and this is seen prominently in Sufism, which is an offshoot of Islam that deals heavily with mysticism and exists in both the Shia and Sunni sects. Now, although Sufism is far more concentrated in places like South Asia and North Africa rather than in Southern Africa, it is undoubtedly a very significant detail to consider when looking at inconsistencies in Islamic rhetoric that manages to shame witchcraft while also believing in concepts that bear very striking similarities to beliefs that would be considered pagan. So, as with all Abrahamic faiths, Islam believes in the existence of a singular, all-knowing, all-powerful deity, which is God. But in addition to that, Islamic theology also believes in the existence of beings known as jinn, which are also known as genies in Western culture. Jinn are basically a type of demon that exists in Islamic theology, and in addition to the existence of these demons, Muslims also believe in the existence of angels. And according to Dale Wallace, there is an extensive history of various systems of protection being used against jinn by Muslims, which bear quite a similarity to the practice of exorcism in Christianity. In addition to this, Wallace also claims that Sufi women in South Africa are particularly important in the fact that they sell various spells and talismans in local shopping centers, which further solidifies the importance of Sufism in the discussion of mysticism in Islam. Of particular note, small details like this go on to prove how Islam and other Abrahamic religions show a bit of hypocrisy when they shame witchcraft and call it a pagan belief and call it a grave sin against God, when the faith in and of itself is rooted in concepts and ideas that many would consider to be supernatural and of a sort of mystic quality.
South Africa is a prominent example of the usage of witchcraft within a community. Adam Ashforth, a well-known anthropologist, collected an immense amount of ethnographic research regarding witchcraft, specifically within South Africa. Ashforth's work consisted of methodologies and ritualistic practices utilized by the witches within the area. It is the public knowledge and secrets that educate individuals on the solid foundations developed by families that have influenced 3 or more generations living within the same communities of South Africa. This extension of family is seen as a spiritual connection to the land, which causes people to believe that families are involved in witchcraft. For example, a witch of Mapilta was a well-known older woman who was spoken about as a quote-unquote unnamed neighbor for the well-known fact that she actively practiced witchcraft. As she remained unnamed, she was utilized as a place of blame when someone fell ill or happened upon some misfortune or ongoings in their life. These negative effects were said to be caused by inherited evil powers and the generational pass down of recipes known as muti. Muti, translated to English, is medicine or poison, which is exactly what can be utilized for. The substance, on one hand, is intended to inflict negative impacts, which consist of illness, misfortune, and death, or bring wealth or power to the witch who created it. On the other hand, it can be intended as a positive process that involves healing, cleansing, strength, and protection for the intended person. Although this may vary, it holds much power within the community. Another form of ritualistic practices and methods of study consists of circumcision rituals that allow boys their passage into manhood through a lived hardship. This and many others are just the beginning of the many rituals passed down through generations and taken from the superstitions and accusations towards peers. Along with the superstitions that surround communities, there are many debates on whether to believe in witchcraft at all. Between believing and not believing in witchcraft stands a fine line that many speculate on throughout South Africa. The questions that circulate in regard to South Africa have to do with the rationality versus modernity and witchcraft practices. Due to the entanglement between colonialism in Africa and concept of modernism, the term witchcraft can be lost in translation due to negative stereotypes. The lack of representation throughout the pass down of information through ritualistic practices and oral storytelling, how this aspect of certain cultures, i.e. witchcraft, is lost in urbanization over time, how this affects witchcraft practices. Many ideologies surrounding witchcraft have dwindled throughout the communities that used to thrive within these ideas. Due to urbanization and the migration of families, it has impacted the beliefs in witchcraft and its validity. Again, this brings us back to the debate between rationality and modernity of witchcraft. The question of rationality is raised regarding the ideology that quote-unquote thinkers of today have identified as absurd assumptions that witches and witchcraft hold any truth at all. On the other hand, the current discussions that social media platforms and studies conducted have seen evolutionary characteristics that aid certain areas practicing witchcraft to keep up with modern times in regard to their areas. Some platforms have expanded to social media to raise awareness and further share different ways to practice witchcraft in various areas of the world. Although believing and not believing in witchcraft can be quantified through statistical data taken and through surveys, it is also believed that one's own opinion and generational right to carry on through their families and lives to keep these ideas alive. Africa has a deeply rooted history in regard to healers of many variations that specialize in specific fields, many of which are subject to ridicule and speculations that they are involved in witchcraft practices, therefore creating a negative association with the title witch doctor. It is believed in this culture that witches are utilized to inflict negative things upon others by providing something bad to the individual that inflicts misfortune on another. On the other hand, doctors are seen to only heal others and not to do negative things and impact others' lives. The constant debate between the two types of practices causes rifts between communities. Muti, as mentioned before, is a substance traditionally administered by healers to patients in distress, but is roughly translated in English to medicine or poison. The various types of muti can be attributed to different results, which can be identified through the color, black or white, to determine whether it will have positive or harmful results. This substance effect is based upon the intentions of the individual receiving the muti and how they wish to utilize it. But witches and healers who use muti, although for different reasons, can result in death regardless of the intention. Another example of traditional healers in South Africa are sangomas, which is an individual who practices Ngomi, which is a belief focused on ancestral spirits. They are involved in a type of healing process that promotes balance between patients and harm and the spirit that is said to be causing their issues. The healer often performs the throwing of bones, purification, and animal ritual sacrifices to communicate with these spirits to help aiding in healing. They also utilize muti as well within their practices. Many types of individuals, whether witch doctors or sangomas, are constant throughout South Africa. Though generational pass down of witchcraft history through oral representation, historical presence, or religious ties, witchcraft has crafted a deeply rooted foundation that through ethnographic study and interpretations it begin to expand and grow as it has for centuries.